Hi, I'm Brad Stone aboard the USS Constellation, where I'm happy to volunteer. It's located in the Inner Harbor of Baltimore. I'm also a volunteer at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick. And I have the opportunity to talk to a lot of foreign visitors. And what I've observed over the years is that most foreign visitors don't know that much about the Civil War, which is to be expected, with one exception. People from Russia know quite a bit about the Civil War, and I've asked them why, and they say it's because they've been taught that Russia played a significant role in supporting the Union cause. And after doing some research, I found that indeed they did. And it revolved around a visit their navies made to both the East and West Coast during 1863, which did have a profound effect in some ways on the outcome of the war. Now, some backdrop. I think this is an important story because many people think of the Civil War as just an internal struggle, which really didn't impact the rest of the world. That was far from the case. It did have an enormous impact on the rest of the world, and many nations throughout the world were very concerned about the outcome of the Civil War, and indeed did try to influence it to varying degrees. One of those nations was Russia. Now, in looking at the relationship between Russia and the United States in the 1860s, they were very different countries. They were literally worlds apart. On the one hand, you had the United States, which is a relatively young nation, a democratic republic, and at its head, you have Abraham Lincoln, a man of the people, comes from very humble circumstances and rises to be democratically elected as President of the United States in 1860, and will take office in 1861. Now, in Russia, you have an autocratic regime headed up by Tsar Alexander II. He is the heir to the Romanov dynasty, which has been in power for 300 years. In theory, he is an absolute ruler. So again, if you look at these two countries on the surface, they seem vastly different. But if you dig a little deeper, there are some very strong commonalities between these two countries. They both bestride vast areas, continents. They are both very ambitious. They want to modernize. They want to expand across these continents by building up their infrastructure, railroads, telegraphs, roads, and in the process, they're looking for a lot of foreign capital to do this. The other thing is that both of these countries are beset with some major problems, both internal and external. And one of the most sort of existential threats to both is the question of slavery. Now, we all know that in the United States, slavery is the root of the Civil War, and that's one of the big issues that Abraham Lincoln is going to have to wrestle with in terms of keeping the Union together. That issue of slavery affects more than 4 million enslaved African Americans. In Russia, they have a similar problem. They have the problem of serfdom. The serfs are a slave class in Russia. It's not identical to American slavery. In some ways, it's somewhat less brutal, but nonetheless, it affects more than 23 million people in the Russian Empire at that time. Now, Alexander II has been wrestling with the issue. He wants to emancipate the serfs, but there are significant problems in doing so. Those serfs are owned by the nobility, and many of his advisors warn him against emancipating the serfs, or at least doing it in any quick way, because it will cause the nobility to perhaps rise up and try to overthrow him. On the other hand, he's aware that he can't, keep stalling the emancipation of the serfs because they, in turn, will be likely to rise up and perhaps overturn him. So he's dealing with this dilemma for years. But ironically, at the time that Abraham Lincoln is about to take the oath of office of the President of the United States, the Tsar, through what he believes is divine direction, decides to, on his own, issue what he calls an Emancipation Manifesto, which commits the Russian Empire to emancipating all the serfs. Now he takes an interesting approach on this. He doesn't do so immediately. He does it over the course of 2 years, and built into the process, he provides reparations both for the noble classes and for the serfs. Now, his action, spurs the kinds of reaction in the United States you would expect. Those who believe in the institution of slavery are horrified by it. They see it as a very bad precedent, and you can understand why. They think he's upsetting what they would call the natural order of things. They view serfs, like their slaves, as being content with their lot. And by emancipating them, he's going to throw Russia into chaos. Now, people on the abolition side in the United States, they view his approach as too timid, too gradual. And people like Horace Greeley will say that this will cause the peasant class to rise up and also lead to the destruction of Russia. Now, in retrospect, his approach pretty much did work out. I mean, in terms of Tsarist Russia and what occurs throughout the history of Tsarist Russia, the emancipation of the serfs, relatively speaking, is a successful transition. Now, it's not known what Abraham Lincoln's attitude was toward this and whether it at all affected his approach to emancipation. But what is noteworthy is that when he did emancipate the slaves in the United States, although his approach is in no way identical to the Tsar's, it has some similar features insofar as it's kind of a gradual, kind of a conditional approach. So again, despite these men's differences in many ways, in some crucial aspects, they approach things in a surprisingly similar manner. Now, both countries are also beset by foreign dangers. Both countries throughout the early and mid-19th century are having very contentious relationships with Britain and France. And for Russia, this breaks out in the Crimean War in the 1850s, shortly before the American War. It's a bloody, very costly war. And what the Russians noticed during that war is that one of the few nations that openly sympathizes with them is the United States. And this has an enormous impact on Russian attitudes towards the United States. So when the war breaks out, the Civil War breaks out, the Russians make it very clear from the outset that they strongly support the survival of the Union. Their foreign minister will issue a communique to the American government letting them know that Russia is strongly in favor of preserving the Union. And the Tsar even takes the added step at the bottom of the communique to write in his handwriting, "So be it." Now, the attitude of the British and French toward the United States is far different. Because of commercial and geopolitical reasons, both the British and French are both very sympathetic to the Southern cause. Throughout the early part of the war, there will be a lot of tensions between Britain and the United States. At times, it looks like the British may actually intervene against the United States or the Union. At one point in October of 1862, the British are emboldened to issue an ultimatum to both the Union and the Confederacy, saying that unless the war is resolved, they are going to take action to make it happen. This is a very thinly veiled threat at the Union. The French Empire, under the rule of Napoleon III, is also very favorably disposed to the Confederate cause. The reason being is they're attempting to install a puppet government in Mexico. And they believe that if America, gets divided, they'll have a far easier time of establishing their influence in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Now, Lincoln, when he issues his Emancipation Proclamation, helps to stall off some of the momentum in both France and England towards jumping in and actively intervening on the part of the South. But even in light of the Emancipation Proclamation, for the rest of the war, there are going to be continuing tensions between the Union and the British and French empires. Now, the situation with Russia between these two countries is also very tense, particularly going into 1863. So, one of the big concerns of the United States, if a war should break out with these other powers, is what will happen to the American Navy. The American Navy during the Civil War is modernized, it's being expanded greatly, and by the end of the war, it's one of the world's largest navies. But it's very thinly spread. It's got a lot of responsibilities. It has to maintain a 3,500-mile blockade of southern ports. It has to continue to protect American interests abroad, protect its merchant shipping, go after Confederate raiders that are attacking that shipping, and operate offensive measures in the inland waterways of the United States. This is a big responsibility. And there's no way that the Union Navy, as large as it is, or was, could have gone one-on-one with the British or French fleets, particularly if they were combined. Now, Russia is facing a similar problem in 1863 over the issue of Poland. They dominate Poland, and in the early 1860s, the Polish people start to rise up to demand their independence, their sovereignty, and the Russians brutally suppress those uprisings. This causes an outcry in Europe, and both Britain and France try to take advantage of that situation to push the Russians out of Poland and, again, limit its influence in Europe in general. So throughout 1863, leading up to the summer of 1863, the British and French are issuing more and more strident warnings to Russia that unless it recognizes Polish sovereignty and leaves Poland, this could cause a war. And the Russians are responding in kind, saying that they view this matter as an internal domestic matter. They will not tolerate any interference by any foreign powers. By the summer of 1863, the Tsar and his ministers are convinced that this will lead to war. Now, one of the big concerns for the Russians is what would happen to their navy in the event of the war. Their navy is also being modernized. Their navy is also being expanded, but it's nowhere near big enough to to go up against either the British or the French. And one other big problem is that both their Pacific and Atlantic fleets have very constrained access to the two oceans that they service. And they fear that in the event of the war, the British and the French Navy will bottle up their fleets in the Pacific and the Atlantic and systematically destroy them. So they need to come up with a plan. And the head of the Russian Navy in the summer of 1863, his name is Creó, comes up with a brilliant plan, a very daring one, proposes it to the Tsar, and they implement it. What it will do is they will take their fleets in the Atlantic and the Pacific and have them come to American ports. The Atlantic fleet will come to New York. The Pacific fleet will come to San Francisco. This is done in secret. And in order to keep it a secret from the British and the French, they will send portions of their fleet out incrementally, and even the commanders of the fleet and their crews will not know their final destinations until they open up sealed orders on their way to San Francisco and New York. This is also kept secret from the United States until the fleets are about to arrive. In September of 1863, the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, receives the information that the Russians are coming to New York and San Francisco. He is overjoyed. He sees this as a symbol that the Russians have confidence that the United States or the Union will win the war. So at the end of September, both fleets arrive at their destination, and they are welcomed with overwhelming celebrations, greetings from the people of San Francisco and New York. Now, what's the plan? Why are the Russians doing this? Well, it's not only to protect their fleets from being balled up, but the Russians know that even though their fleets are no match for the British and French navies. Many of their ships are very quick and are very well adapted to attacking merchant vessels. And what they know is that by placing them in places like New York and San Francisco, they will be very close to the major shipping lines in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, giving them a perfect vantage point to attack and savage British and French merchant ships, and thereby cripple both their economies. The Russians also know that it's very unlikely that the British or the French will try to retaliate against those ships while they're in American ports, because America would be a neutral nation, and to attack those ports would cause war to break out between the United States and the British and the French. Now, the Russians are gambling that although the British and the French may be willing to take on the Russians, or they may be willing to take on the Americans, they're not willing to take them both on at the same time. And the Russians further understand that by going to the United States, they will be welcomed. They will be seen as showing solidarity with the Union cause. And they're correct on all these counts. Now the question becomes, would the Russians really, the fleets really work to protect those harbors, their host harbors in the United States in the event of attack? Well, one city that's really hoping it will is San Francisco. The San Francisco harbor is very poorly defended throughout most of the Civil War. It's defended by a disjointed series of forts run by the Army. The naval presence, the US naval presence, is very minimalist, to say the least. Very often the only armored ship in the harbor is a revenue ship, what we would call a Coast Guard cutter today, the Shubrick, which is a fairly lightly armed warship. So San Franciscans are always on edge that they may be attacked by Confederate raiders. So when they see the Russian Navy come in, they're hoping that if push comes to shove, they will protect it. Now, the Russians are greeted wherever they go. Their ships tour up and down the East Coast. They're treated to parades, lavish receptions. When one ship comes near Washington, D.C., even Mrs. Lincoln comes down to toast the health of the Tsar. In fact, even the president would like to attend these receptions, but he becomes ill and was not able to attend it. So increasingly, there's a stronger and stronger bond between the Russian fleets and their host cities. And again, there's an incident that occurs in San Francisco that really drives this home. In October of 1863, a massive fire breaks out in the financial district of San Francisco. It threatens to burn down the whole city. Without even being asked, the commander of the Russian Pacific Fleet, Admiral Popov, dispatches over 200 men into San Francisco to try to contain the fire. Thanks largely to their help, the fire is contained. Several of those sailors are injured. 6 Russian sailors die, and they're still buried in San Francisco. The people of San Francisco are enormously grateful. They, again, honor Admiral Popov, his men. They present the injured men with golden medals. And again, it's a very strong bonding experience between the people of San Francisco and the Russian fleet. And it's these interactions that I think over time really causes a change in attitude among the Russians. Although initially they're sending these fleets over for their own geopolitical reasons, their determination to protect these ports grows from just protecting them against an attack by English or French enemies to perhaps even extending to protecting them against Confederate attacks. And as the winter of 1863 and 1864 comes, again, the people of San Francisco are very, very concerned because they are hearing reports that the Confederate raiding ships Alabama and Sumter are off the coast and they're going to attack San Francisco and either, completely flatten it, or hold it for ransom. Again, San Francisco is woefully unprepared to defend itself. So the city fathers go to Admiral Popoff to plead for his protection. And Popoff does something extraordinary. Without even checking with his superiors in Russia, he immediately says that his ships will defend the port against any Confederate attack. He orders his commanders to, make way should any Confederate raider come in, and warn them that they will defend the port, and if those warnings are ignored, they will open fire on those Confederate ships. Now, again, what he is basically doing is he's committing Russia, which is technically a neutral country, to actively getting involved on behalf of the Union in our Civil War. Now, when his order comes to the attention of his superiors at the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C., and in Russia itself, they're somewhat taken aback because, again, what he is doing is he's committing to involvement for the Union cause. But their response is kind of interesting. They are trying to reel him back. They do remind him Russia is a neutral country. They do tell him most of these Confederate raiders are operating against merchant ships in the international waters, so you should not get involved in that. And they also said that if those raiders come to these ports and they attack only the forts, they direct their fire only at the forts, you're not to get involved. But even they give him an enormous loophole to take action if these ports are attacked. They said in the event that the raiding ships go past the ports and go in to attack the cities themselves, that for humanitarian purposes, you should attack those Confederate ships. So what the what the Russian government is doing, in effect, in a backhanded way, is saying, even though we don't have a formal alliance with the Union, for humanitarian reasons, you are authorized to attack any Confederate ships attacking these cities. That's a very big commitment for a technically neutral nation to make. So, in 1864, things turn around. Fortunately, these attacks never materialize. Fortunately, things start to go better for the Union cause. And the threat against Russia from England and France also begins to dissipate. So by April of 1864, the Tsar feels comfortable to tell his fleet to begin to come home. And when the fleets start to leave in the process, again, there's an overwhelming of gratitude from the American people, not just in the port cities, but from all over the North. And this strong relationship will foster a very strong relationship between the two countries. That will lead a couple of years later to this. You may recognize this flag. This is the flag of the state that we know of as Alaska. 2 years after the Civil War, the Russian Empire will sell their territory of the Alaska to America on very generous terms. They sell it to us for $7.2 million. That is $133 million in today's money. It's still a bargain. It factors out to about 23 cents an acre. Why are they doing this? Again, because of the strong bonds between these two countries. The Russians also want to make sure that the British don't end up expanding westward to become their neighbors across the Bering Sea. So, as you can see, this is a very important chapter in American history. It shows that the Civil War did have international implications, and that a number of nations, including Russia, tried to influence the outcome of the war, and that their actions still have implications to this very day in the United States. For example, the state of Alaska. So I thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I hope that you will visit the USS Constellation, the last remaining ship of the Union Navy, here at the Historic Ships in Baltimore Museum. I also hope that you very much visit the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland. Both places are very educational. They're a lot of fun. And to get the most out of them, I hope that you get memberships to both. So thank you very much.